Have you ever felt like, no matter what you do, your relationships, your choices, or even your moods seem to be controlled by someone else, and you can't quite put your finger on why? In the first 15 seconds, I want you to understand one shocking truth. Emotional control is often invisible, subtle, and silent, and most people who are manipulating you don't even look or feel like manipulators at all. They are not always abusive in the obvious sense, but they have mastered the art of influencing your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in ways that leave you second-guessing yourself, questioning your own judgment, and feeling trapped in patterns that seem impossible to escape. Emotional control is a psychological strategy that operates below your awareness, and the frightening part is that your brain often unconsciously participates in its own manipulation because it seeks harmony, validation, or approval from the very person who is controlling it. You may think it is normal, natural, or even your fault, but the truth is that subtle manipulation can hijack your mind and emotions without you realizing it. Emotional control often begins quietly, with small behaviors that seem innocent or caring, but over time, they create a pattern where one person's needs, desires, or moods dictate the reality of the other. It can start as gentle criticism, microaggressions, or offhand remarks about your decisions, which slowly train your brain to doubt your own judgment. When someone repeatedly tells you that you are overreacting, too sensitive, or making poor choices, your mind begins to internalize these messages, and before long, you question not just the situation, but your own feelings, thoughts, and instincts. This is the first stage of subtle domination, shaping perception and eroding confidence without ever raising suspicion. Emotional controllers do not always shout, demand, or impose openly, because their power is far more effective when it is invisible, leaving you believing that your doubt, anxiety, or guilt is self-generated rather than instilled. One of the key signs of emotional control is the constant feeling of walking on eggshells around someone, where every word, action, or choice feels scrutinized or judged, and you instinctively monitor yourself to avoid conflict. This hypervigilance is exhausting because your mind is operating in a defensive state almost constantly, anticipating disapproval, rejection, or anger. Over time, this mental strain can affect your confidence, decision-making, and even your physical health, because stress hormones flood your system whenever your brain perceives a potential threat. When you are in the presence of an emotional controller, you are rarely relaxed or authentic. Instead, you are performing, censoring, and negotiating your behavior to satisfy an unseen standard that constantly shifts depending on their mood or needs. The subtlety is what makes it so dangerous, because it disguises control as normal relational dynamics, care, or concern, while systematically eroding your autonomy. Another major tactic emotional controllers use is guilt, manipulation, and emotional leverage, where your sense of obligation, loyalty, or empathy is weaponized to influence your decisions. They may imply that your choices will hurt them, disrupt harmony, or make you selfish if you act independently. And you begin to internalize the idea that your needs are secondary, invalid, or even dangerous to the relationship. Your brain, seeking social acceptance and connection, often complies, because social harmony has been wired into humans as essential for survival. This creates a feedback loop where you suppress your desires, emotions, and boundaries to avoid guilt or conflict, while the controller's power subtly increases with every concession. Over time, your sense of identity, personal agency, and emotional freedom erodes, leaving you dependent on validation, approval, or permission to act. control can also be exerted through inconsistency, unpredictability, and emotional highs and lows, which trains your brain to become hyper-focused on the other person's moods. When someone alternates between warmth, approval, and affection, with coldness, criticism, or withdrawal, your mind becomes obsessed with predicting and interpreting their reactions, often sacrificing your own stability in the process. This manipulation technique is known as intermittent reinforcement, and it is highly effective because the brain craves reward, attention, and connection. Every time a positive response appears after a period of withdrawal or disapproval, it triggers a dopamine response, reinforcing the pattern of compliance and obsession. Your mind becomes addicted to the fluctuating validation, making it increasingly difficult to recognize the manipulation as it unfolds. Isolation is another hallmark of emotional control, where subtle tactics are used to limit your access to outside perspectives, support networks, or alternative points of view. This may involve sowing doubt about friends, family, or mentors, implying that they are untrustworthy, judgmental, or harmful, or making you feel that only the controller understands, supports, or truly cares about you. As a result, your social and emotional reference points shrink, and you become more dependent on the controller for validation, guidance, and emotional stability. The brain, wired to seek safety and belonging, internalizes this dynamic, gradually reducing your resistance, independence, and critical thinking. Emotional isolation does not have to be overt to be effective. Even small, repeated efforts over time create a mental environment where autonomy feels risky or undesirable. Another subtle but powerful indicator is the consistent undermining of your confidence, competence, or self-worth, often masked as advice, jokes, or concern. An emotional controller may make comments that question your intelligence, decisions, or abilities, while framing them as helpful, humorous, or constructive criticism. Over time, your mind internalizes these comments, creating self-doubt and second-guessing, which leads to a reduction in initiative and an increased reliance on the controller for guidance or validation. Your thoughts begin to mirror their language, critiques, and assumptions, making the manipulation self-perpetuating. This tactic is particularly insidious because it appears logical, rational, or even caring, but it subtly rewires your perception of yourself, leaving you vulnerable to long-term influence without ever realizing it. Finally, emotional controllers often exploit your empathy, compassion, and loyalty to ensure compliance and influence. Because humans are wired to respond to the suffering or distress of others, an emotional controller can exaggerate problems, crises, or emotional vulnerability to elicit help, obedience, or accommodation. The brain, interpreting these cues as urgent threats to well-being, prioritizes their needs above your own, creating patterns where you feel compelled to act, appease, or sacrifice. Over time, your decision-making and sense of self become entangled with their emotional state, and your autonomy diminishes without dramatic confrontation, which is why emotional control is often more effective and damaging than overt aggression. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward recognizing them in your life, but the challenge lies in how deeply ingrained these tactics are, how normalized they feel, and how much your brain has adapted to comply without conscious awareness. In the next section, you will uncover how these signs operate in subtle daily interactions, the psychological mechanisms behind them, and how your mind has been trained to cooperate with control, often without your realizing it, setting the stage for recognizing the 7 unmistakable signs of emotional domination. Second signs. Someone is emotionally controlling you. Once you begin to notice subtle patterns of emotional control, The next step is understanding how these behaviors manipulate your perception of reality, because the most effective control is invisible and operates in ways your conscious mind often overlooks. Emotional controllers do not rely solely on overt aggression or blatant commands. Instead, they exploit the natural cognitive, emotional, and social tendencies of the human brain to subtly shape your behavior without you realizing it. Your mind has evolved to prioritize social harmony, empathy, and belonging, and emotional manipulators take advantage of these instincts, creating situations where you voluntarily comply, suppress your own needs, or question your own judgment. This is why emotional control can feel confusing, self-doubt inducing, and even inexplicable, because your brain interprets compliance as a choice rather than a manipulation. Over time, the patterns of influence become so ingrained that it feels normal to defer, apologize excessively, or prioritize someone else's emotional state over your own, even when it conflicts with your values or desires. One of the primary mechanisms emotional controllers exploit is cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that occurs when your beliefs, actions, or feelings are in conflict. When someone manipulates you to act against your instincts or values, your brain automatically attempts to resolve the conflict, often by adjusting your perception of reality rather than challenging the controller's influence. For example, if you want to speak up about a decision but are subtly pressured into compliance, you may convince yourself that you agreed voluntarily or that their guidance is correct, even if deep down you feel resentment or doubt. This internal rationalization makes the manipulation invisible to you while reinforcing the controller's power. Your mind, in an effort to reduce tension, effectively becomes an accomplice to its own limitation, further entrenching emotional control as an automatic pattern. Another subtle technique used to gain control is the strategic use of shame and embarrassment, which taps into deeply rooted social instincts. Humans are wired to avoid behaviors that could lead to social rejection, ridicule, or exclusion, and emotional manipulators exploit this by highlighting flaws, mistakes, or perceived inadequacies in a way that elicits compliance. A sarcastic remark, a seemingly harmless joke, or a pointed comment about your decision-making can create a lingering mental echo, conditioning you to modify your behavior to avoid future discomfort. Over time, the brain internalizes these cues, anticipating disapproval even when it is not explicitly present, and you unconsciously begin to self-censor, second-guess yourself, or seek constant approval. This creates a psychological environment where the controller's influence persists without direct intervention, and your autonomy diminishes quietly but significantly. Emotional control often thrives through the manipulation of trust and dependency, which is why isolation, favoritism, and selective attention are commonly employed. By intermittently providing warmth, validation, or attention, the controller ensures that you remain emotionally tethered and invested, because your brain naturally prioritizes rewarding interactions over negative or neutral ones. This intermittent reinforcement, where positive acknowledgement is unpredictable and sporadic, creates a cycle of anticipation and attachment that can be more powerful than consistent praise. The brain's reward system begins to associate the controller with emotional survival, creating a feedback loop where compliance, attention-seeking, or emotional labor is performed automatically to maintain connection and approval. Over time, this dynamic becomes normalized, making the manipulation almost imperceptible, even as it erodes your independence and emotional resilience. Gaslighting is another tool frequently used in emotionally controlling relationships, and it works by distorting your perception of reality so that you begin to doubt your own memory, judgment, or feelings. Small, repeated instances of denial, misrepresentation, or contradiction make you question your interpretation of events, and the brain, designed to rely on both external cues and internal validation, begins to waver. This creates a dependency on the controller as the perceived arbiter of truth, and your self-confidence diminishes with each encounter. Gaslighting is particularly insidious because it targets the core of your identity and cognitive stability, leading to heightened anxiety, confusion, and a chronic sense of inadequacy. Your mind, which once trusted its instincts and interpretations, now looks externally for guidance, reinforcing the controller's influence over your emotions and decisions. Subtle emotional withholding is another common strategy, where the controller manipulates through omission, silence, or lack of acknowledgement. Emotional withholding exploits the human need for connection and validation, creating a powerful motivator for compliance. When approval, attention, or care is contingent on your behavior, your brain prioritizes avoiding withdrawal over asserting autonomy, because social disconnection historically signaled danger. This psychological lever ensures that your choices increasingly align with the controller's preferences, even when they conflict with your desires, values, or well-being. Over time, the cycle of giving in to subtle pressure becomes automatic, and you may feel trapped without recognizing the invisible rules that govern your interactions. Another hallmark of emotional control is the exploitation of your compassion and empathy, which are strengths that can be weaponized to maintain influence. Emotional manipulators often exaggerate crises, distress, or dependency, eliciting guilt, obligation, or a sense of moral responsibility that overrides your personal boundaries. Your brain, attuned to detecting and responding to the suffering of others, automatically prioritizes their needs, sometimes at the expense of your own. You may find yourself sacrificing time, energy, or decisions repeatedly to meet the emotional demands of the controller, while internalizing the belief that refusal is selfish, harmful, or inappropriate. Over time, this pattern reduces your autonomy and fosters dependency, making the controller's influence feel natural or necessary rather than coercive. Finally, controlling individuals often exploit patterns of emotional escalation, using anger, frustration, or passive-aggressive responses to shape behavior indirectly. When someone reacts unpredictably or intensely to your choices, the brain quickly learns to anticipate negative consequences and preemptively adjust behavior to avoid confrontation. Even in the absence of overt threats, this anticipatory self-regulation conditions you to modify actions, thoughts, and expressions to maintain stability or peace. The subtle manipulation becomes internalized as a habitual mental strategy, where fear of emotional repercussion drives compliance, self-doubt, and anxiety. This is why emotional control is often more effective than physical coercion. The mind cooperates voluntarily, believing it is making rational decisions, when in fact, it has been trained to conform. Understanding these mechanisms is essential to recognizing emotional control in daily life, because awareness is the first step toward disentangling your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors from someone else's influence. The challenge is that the tactics are highly adaptive, subtle, and often masked as care, humor, guidance, or concern. Your brain, wired for social connection, empathy, and avoidance of conflict, often participates in the manipulation unknowingly, reinforcing patterns that diminish your confidence, autonomy, and self-trust. In the next section, you will discover the 7 unmistakable signs of emotional control, the subtle cues that reveal it in any relationship, and the ways your mind has been conditioned to comply without conscious consent, setting the stage for clarity, understanding, and eventual freedom. Third signs: someone is emotionally controlling you. As you move deeper into awareness, it becomes clear that emotional control is not defined by a single dramatic moment, but by a series of repeated subtle behaviors that slowly bend your will and shape your identity over time. One of the most telling signs of emotional control is the gradual disappearance of your authentic voice, where your opinions start to feel dangerous, unnecessary, or burdensome to express. At first, you might notice that you hold back small thoughts or minor disagreements to keep the peace. But over time, this silence expands into major decisions, dreams, and boundaries. Your brain learns that self-expression leads to tension, conflict, or withdrawal. So it chooses safety over honesty. And in doing so, it sacrifices parts of your truth to maintain relational stability. This internal suppression is not always conscious, but it is deeply rooted in your body and mind. And it signals that someone has trained you, intentionally or not, to fear your own voice. Another powerful sign is the subtle shift in how you view yourself, where your self-image becomes distorted through the lens of the controlling person's perceptions, reactions, and commentary. You start to define yourself less by your internal truth and more by how they see you, how they respond to you, and how satisfied they are with your behavior. If they praise you, you feel worthy, and if they criticize or withdraw, you feel defective, lost, or confused, which means your emotional state becomes tethered to their evaluation. Your brain, seeking stability, begins to prioritize their approval as a measure of reality, and this dependency steadily weakens your sense of identity. The deeper this pattern goes, the more disconnected you become from your authentic self, and the easier it becomes for another person to shape who you believe you are. Emotional control also appears in how your sense of choice becomes limited, even when no direct rule or demand is spoken. You may technically be free to choose, but you feel an invisible pressure to act in ways that align with their expectations, because any deviation creates discomfort, guilt, or emotional distance. This invisible leash is one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of control, because you cannot point to a visible chain, yet your behavior is modified all the same. Your brain anticipates consequences that may not even be spoken, and to avoid them, it edits your desires before they ever turn into actions. When your mind is making decisions based on fear, obligation, or emotional survival, rather than genuine intention, it is a clear sign that control has reached a deep psychological level. Another unmistakable sign is chronic self-blame, where every problem, argument, or misunderstanding is somehow twisted into being your fault. Even when the circumstances are clearly complicated, shared, or initiated by the other person, you are made to feel that you overreacted, misunderstood, caused the tension, or failed in some fundamental way. Over time, this constant burden of responsibility reshapes your inner dialogue, and the voice in your head becomes critical, apologetic, and submissive. You begin to apologize for existing, for having needs, and for expressing discomfort, and this signals that emotional control has become internalized. The controller may not even need to accuse you anymore, because your brain has learned to do it for them, creating a self-sustaining loop of dominance and submission. Emotional control can also be seen in how your emotional landscape narrows, where you feel fewer emotions that are truly your own, and more emotions that are reactions to the controlling person's moods. When they are happy, you feel relief, and when they are upset, you feel anxious, regardless of your own inner state or the circumstances around you. This emotional mirroring is not natural empathy, but a survival-driven adaptation, where your mind has learned that your safety and stability depend on reading and responding to another person's emotional signals. Over time, this hyper-attunement disconnects you from your internal world and anchors you in their emotional reality, which is one of the most profound forms of psychological takeover. You no longer ask how you feel. Instead, you ask how they feel and adjust yourself accordingly. Another deeply revealing sign of emotional control is the presence of confusion instead of clarity, where your mind constantly feels foggy, uncertain, and conflicted. You may feel as though you cannot remember conversations clearly, that your understanding of events is distorted, or that your emotions do not make logical sense. This inner chaos is not accidental, because consistent manipulation fragments your perception of reality. When your experiences are contradicted, minimized, or reframed by the controller, your brain cannot form a coherent narrative, which weakens your ability to make confident decisions. In this mental fog, you become more reliant on the other person's interpretation of reality, which strengthens their influence and reduces your independence. A further sign is the gradual neglect of your own needs, desires, and goals. As your life becomes increasingly organized around the needs, problems, and expectations of the other person, you may stop pursuing your passions, distancing yourself from what once mattered to you because it does not align with their vision, preferences, or approval. Your time, energy, and focus shift away from self-fulfillment and toward emotional maintenance, conflict avoidance, and compliance. Over time, the distance between who you are and who you have become grows wider, and this silent sacrifice of self is one of the clearest indicators that emotional control has taken root. The most painful part is that you may not even remember when this shift began, because it happens slowly, almost invisibly, as piece by piece of your life is surrendered. Another critical sign is the persistent feeling of being trapped without understanding why, where you sense that something is wrong, but you cannot logically explain it. You may feel stuck emotionally, mentally, or even physically, even though no one is physically restraining you. This psychological imprisonment is created by layers of fear, doubt, guilt, and dependency that keep you from imagining freedom, let alone pursuing it. Your brain, conditioned to see the controlling dynamic as normal or necessary, finds it difficult to envision alternative realities where you are autonomous, respected, and emotionally safe. This inability to imagine freedom is one of the strongest indicators that control is operating at a subconscious level. Yet, the fact that you are now becoming aware of these patterns is incredibly important, because awareness disrupts control. The moment you begin to name the feeling, identify the pattern, and observe the changes in your thoughts and behavior, you weaken the invisible authority that has shaped your inner world. Emotional control thrives in darkness, confusion, and denial, but it loses power when brought into conscious awareness. As your perception sharpens, you begin to separate what is truly yours from what has been imposed upon you. And this separation is the first real step toward reclaiming your emotional autonomy. In the next section, you will discover not only how to identify these 7 signs more clearly in your own life, but also the psychological strategies that will begin to dissolve their grip over your mind, your emotions, and your future, allowing you to return to your true self with strength, clarity, and understanding. 4th signs. Someone is emotionally controlling you. And as you keep tracing the subtle patterns of emotional control, what becomes even more unsettling is how quietly it shifts from something occasional into something normalized. Because when you repeatedly question your own feelings, your own perceptions, and your own reactions, you begin to lose the ability to trust the most important voice in your life, which is your own. This is where another sign of emotional control quietly takes root, and it is the steady erosion of your independence through disguised concern. At first, it may look like care, such as when they say things like, "I'm just worried about you," or "I just want to make sure you're safe," or "I'm only saying this because I care about what's best for you." And while genuine care is healthy and welcome, emotional control often hides behind that language in order to limit your freedom. They might question your choices constantly, ask where you are going, who you will be with, how long you will be gone, and what exactly you will be doing. And at first, these questions seem harmless or even affectionate, but over time, they become a quiet interrogation that makes you feel as if you need permission just to exist as yourself. When you start changing your plans, your clothes, your words, or even your dreams to avoid their disapproval, you are no longer living from your own desires, but from their expectations. What makes this so powerful is that they rarely command you outright, because a direct command is easy to resist, but a carefully placed doubt makes you police yourself. And that is the true hallmark of emotional control. Over time, you may notice that your world is getting smaller, not because you chose it to be, but because maintaining connection with others feels like it will create conflict. They might make subtle comments about your friends, saying they are a bad influence, that they do not really care about you, or that they are secretly jealous of your relationship. They may say your family does not understand you like they do, or that your co-workers are trying to bring you down. Each of these statements is designed to plant a seed of separation, and even when you do not fully believe them, you may start pulling away just to keep the peace. Slowly, your support system fades, and the less you hear other perspectives, the more their voice becomes the dominant narrative in your mind. Isolation is one of the strongest tools of emotional control, because human beings need reflection from other human beings to maintain a balanced sense of reality. Once that balance is gone, their version of events becomes your version of events, and your sense of what is normal begins to warp around their needs. Another deeply hidden sign is emotional withholding, and this is one of the most painful because it directly targets your need for connection. Emotional controllers often use affection, attention, and validation as currency, which means that when you behave the way they want, they reward you with warmth, kind words, closeness, and tenderness. And when you do something that displeases them, they take those things away. They might become distant, cold, silent, or suddenly uninterested, and they do not always explain why. You are left replaying conversations in your head, wondering what you did wrong, and trying to fix a problem you do not even fully understand. This creates an emotional dependency, where your sense of worth becomes tied to their approval, and your nervous system stays on edge, waiting to see which version of them you will get. The tragedy of this is that love begins to feel conditional, like a reward you have to earn instead of a safe place you can rest. In situations like this, you may find yourself taking on more and more responsibility for their emotional state, which is another powerful sign of emotional control. If they are unhappy, it is somehow your fault. If they are angry, it is because you provoked them. If they are distant, it is because you did not care enough. You become the emotional caretaker in the relationship, even when the relationship itself is supposed to be balanced. This is especially dangerous because it trains you to ignore your own needs, your own exhaustion, and your own pain in order to maintain their comfort. Over time, you may stop asking for support altogether because you have been conditioned to believe that your feelings are an inconvenience, a burden, or an overreaction. And the less you express your truth, the more invisible you become, not only to them, but also to yourself. You may also notice that they have a way of playing the victim, even when their actions are clearly harmful. When you call them out on something that hurt you, they might respond by telling you how bad you've made them feel, how misunderstood they are, or how much they are suffering. The conversation shifts from your pain to their pain, and before you know it, you are the one apologizing. This tactic is incredibly effective because most people have empathy, and an emotionally controlling person exploits that empathy to avoid accountability. You end up feeling guilty for even bringing up your feelings, which trains you to stay silent the next time something goes wrong. This cycle deepens the control because they are never required to change, and you are always required to adapt. As this pattern continues, your inner world begins to change in subtle but serious ways. You may begin to second-guess your decisions, even when they have nothing to do with the controlling person. You might struggle to make simple choices because you have been conditioned to look to someone else for approval. You might feel a constant background anxiety, as if you are always on the edge of doing something wrong, even when you are alone. This is the psychological residue of control, and it does not disappear easily because it is not just in your thoughts. It is in your nervous system. Your body has learned to associate independence with danger and approval with safety. Yet even within this awareness, there is a spark of power starting to build, because recognition is the beginning of freedom. When you start naming these patterns, when you start seeing them as strategies rather than coincidences, you begin to reclaim pieces of yourself that have been buried. You start to realize that your feelings are not overreactions, your needs are not too much, and your independence is not a threat to healthy love. The truth is that emotional control only works when it operates in the shadows of your awareness, and the moment you bring it into the light, it begins to weaken. You start to feel the difference between genuine care and disguised control. You begin to sense when something is off, instead of instantly dismissing your intuition. And even though this realization can be painful, it is also deeply empowering, because it reminds you that you are not powerless. You are simply waking up. Still, the journey does not stop here, because there is another layer to emotional control that is even more difficult to spot. And it is the way it disguises itself as love, loyalty, and deep connection, which is exactly what you are going to uncover as this continues. Because once you see that final piece, the entire picture becomes impossible to ignore, and your mind will never look at relationships the same way again. Fifth signs: someone is emotionally controlling you. And the more you begin to understand how emotional control disguises itself as protection and care, the more you start to see the next sign emerging, which is how they subtly rewrite the concept of love itself in your mind, shaping it into something that serves their need for dominance rather than mutual respect. They may often speak about loyalty in a way that feels intense and almost romantic, saying things like, "It's you and me against the world," or "Nobody will ever love you the way I do." And at first, those words might make you feel special and chosen, as if you occupy a unique and irreplaceable position in their life. But what those words are really doing is creating an emotional cage. Because if it is only you and them, then any outside influence becomes an enemy, and any independent thought becomes a betrayal. Love becomes less about shared growth and more about exclusive possession, which slowly breaks down your sense of autonomy while convincing you that this is passion, devotion, and depth. This illusion of intense connection can be incredibly intoxicating because it fills a deep human need to feel seen and significant. And an emotionally controlling person knows exactly how to activate that need in you in order to secure their position. They might mirror your dreams, your fears, your values, and your wounds, making it seem as though you have found someone who truly understands you on a level nobody else ever has. They may reveal secrets, vulnerabilities, and pain from their past very quickly, which creates a fast emotional bond, and you might feel honored that they trust you so much. But in reality, this rapid intimacy is not about connection. It is about attachment, because when you feel responsible for someone's healing, you are less likely to leave them, even when their behavior starts to harm you. As time goes on, the intensity that once felt romantic can turn into pressure, and you may feel as though you are constantly being measured against an invisible standard that you were never even told about. They might hint that you are not doing enough, not trying hard enough, or not showing enough love, even when you are already giving everything you have. You might start overcompensating, trying to prove your loyalty, your commitment, and your worth. And in doing so, you slowly abandon parts of yourself that once made you who you are. Your world becomes centered around keeping them satisfied, keeping them close, and keeping the relationship intact, even if it means shrinking your own identity. Another sign begins to appear in the way they react to your successes, your happiness, and your growth. Instead of celebrating your achievements and encouraging your progress, they may respond with indifference, jealousy, or subtle discouragement. They might change the subject when you share good news, point out potential problems instead of offering support, or even accuse you of becoming different or too full of yourself. Over time, you may notice that you stop sharing your wins because their reaction makes you feel uncomfortable or guilty. This is not random behavior, because an emotionally controlling person often feels threatened by your confidence and independence. So rather than lifting you up, they try to keep you at a level where they still feel superior or necessary. In some cases, they may even create situations where you become dependent on them in practical ways, such as managing your finances, making important decisions for you, or discouraging you from pursuing opportunities that would give you more power or stability. They may frame this as them taking care of you, leading you, or protecting you from failure. But what it really does is reduce your ability to function fully on your own. And the more dependent you become, the harder it feels to imagine a life without them, even if that life would be healthier and more peaceful. This is one of the most difficult traps to recognize, because it develops so gradually that it feels natural, like a slow shift instead of a sudden takeover. You may also notice that whenever you try to set a boundary, even a small one, they respond with resistance, confusion, or emotional backlash. They might say you are being selfish, cold, or distant. They might claim that you are changing for the worse, or that someone else is turning you against them. They may even mock your attempt to protect yourself, saying things like, "You're too sensitive," or "You're overthinking again," or "Why are you being so dramatic?" Each time you assert your needs, they respond in a way that makes you doubt whether you were right to speak up at all. And eventually, you may stop setting boundaries altogether, because it feels easier to stay quiet than to deal with the emotional consequences. As this dynamic continues, it starts to reshape your inner dialogue. The voice in your head, which once sounded like encouragement or curiosity, may start to sound like criticism, doubt, and fear. You may hear their words even when they are not around, guiding your choices and judging your actions. This internalized control is one of the most powerful effects of an emotionally manipulative relationship, because even if they are not physically present, their influence continues operating inside your mind. And when you begin to live under that internal voice, you are no longer just responding to a person. You are responding to a belief system that has been planted within you. Yet, even here, even within this deeply embedded pattern, there is something beginning to move inside you. It might feel like a quiet discomfort, a subtle resistance, a small part of you that is starting to remember who you were before the control began. You might find yourself missing the version of you who laughed freely, who dreamed boldly, who spoke without fear of being judged or punished. That memory is not an accident, because it is the part of you that knows the truth, the part of you that has not been fully silenced. And the more you listen to that part, the louder it becomes. You begin to understand that love is not supposed to feel like walking on eggshells, and care is not supposed to feel like a cage. You start to realize that someone who truly loves you does not need to shrink you in order to keep you close. They do not need to confuse you in order to keep you loyal. They do not need to silence you in order to stay powerful. Real love is expansive, not restrictive, and real connection gives you more of yourself, not less. This awareness does not instantly set you free, but it cracks the illusion that has been holding you in place. And through that crack, a new perspective begins to form. But even as you start to see this truth, there is still one more sign of emotional control that is incredibly important to recognize. And it is the way hope itself is used as a tool against you. They may promise change, growth, and a better future, especially when they sense that you are pulling away. They may suddenly become the person you always wanted them to be, showing kindness, remorse, and understanding. And just when you start to believe that things are finally shifting, they slowly slip back into the same patterns as before. This creates a cycle of hope and disappointment that is incredibly hard to break because you are not attached to who they are. You are attached to who they could be. That is exactly where the last and most revealing sign lives, and it is the one that, once you see it clearly, changes everything. And it is the one you are about to confront as this continues, because this final realization has the power to either keep you trapped forever or set you free in a way you may never have thought possible. The sixth signs: someone is emotionally controlling you. And as you reach this point in understanding emotional control, the final and perhaps most insidious sign begins to emerge, which is the way your mind itself becomes a partner in your own manipulation. Because emotional controllers do not just influence your actions. They subtly reshape your thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs so that you participate in your own containment. Over time, you may notice that you anticipate their reactions before you act, censor your words before you speak, and second-guess every decision, even when they are not present. And this internalized vigilance is one of the most powerful forms of control, because it no longer relies on their active interference. It has become automatic. Your brain, trained to avoid conflict, seek approval, and maintain emotional equilibrium, quietly compels compliance, making you feel responsible for both their happiness and your own stability. What begins as subtle self-monitoring gradually transforms into a habitual state of hyper-awareness, where independence feels risky, assertiveness feels threatening, and self-expression feels dangerous. Another key dimension of this control is the way fear is weaponized without overt threat, because emotional controllers often cultivate an environment where subtle cues, facial expressions, or shifts in tone elicit anxiety, guilt, or worry. Your nervous system becomes conditioned to respond preemptively, creating a state of constant tension where you are always prepared for potential disapproval or emotional withdrawal. This learned hypervigilance is exhausting because your brain cannot differentiate between real threats and anticipated emotional reactions. And the more time you spend in this state, the more your resilience, confidence, and clarity erode. What feels like self-doubt is actually a byproduct of carefully orchestrated psychological patterns designed to maintain dominance while avoiding overt confrontation. Control also manifests in the gradual distortion of your memory and perception, which makes you question what is real, what is imagined, and what actually happened. Emotional manipulators often deny previous statements, reinterpret events, or subtly accuse you of misunderstanding, creating confusion and uncertainty in your mind. Over time, you begin to rely on them as the ultimate authority on reality, even though their version is biased and self-serving. This form of gaslighting is particularly potent because it targets the foundation of self-trust, eroding your ability to rely on your own experiences, emotions, and judgment. The more uncertain you become, the more power they wield, and the cycle reinforces itself invisibly, leaving you trapped in a psychological labyrinth without clear exits. Another deeply hidden mechanism is the exploitation of your moral compass and empathy, because emotionally controlling people understand that humans are wired to respond to the suffering, needs, and vulnerabilities of others. They may exaggerate crises, highlight your perceived failures, or frame situations in ways that compel you to act in service of them rather than yourself. Over time, your decisions are shaped less by your values and more by the subtle obligation to alleviate their discomfort, guilt, or anger. Your mind internalizes these cues, creating automatic compliance, because the cost of refusal or emotional resistance is experienced as too threatening to your stability or sense of connection. You begin to measure every choice against their emotional state, rather than your own intentions, which is the essence of psychological captivity. Isolation, even when partial or subtle, further amplifies this control, because reducing your access to alternative perspectives, support networks, and external validation makes the manipulator the primary source of emotional calibration. They may question the reliability of friends or family, imply that outsiders cannot understand you, or subtly reward withdrawal from relationships that challenge their influence. Your brain, wired for social survival, interprets this narrowing as necessary, reinforcing dependence on the controller. Each step away from external validation makes the patterns of manipulation more entrenched, and your sense of autonomy diminishes with every subtle concession, making escape seem riskier and compliance feels safer. Another characteristic is the way hope is manipulated, creating cycles of reward and disappointment that keep you invested in the relationship despite harm. At intervals, they may show kindness, validation, or affection, reinforcing attachment and creating a sense that change is possible. These intermittent reinforcements release dopamine in your brain, producing anticipation and emotional highs that are remembered more vividly than periods of control, manipulation, or withdrawal. Your mind begins to chase these emotional peaks, rationalizing, forgiving, and excusing behaviors that undermine your well-being. This cycle creates a powerful psychological bond that is difficult to break because it exploits both reward pathways and emotional attachments simultaneously. The final layer of internal control appears in the chronic suppression of your authentic self, where your goals, desires, and preferences are gradually pushed aside to accommodate the manipulator's expectations. You may stop pursuing hobbies, speaking your truth, or expressing discomfort, because every action feels like it could provoke disapproval or conflict. Over time, your sense of identity begins to merge with the narrative imposed by the controlling individual, making it increasingly difficult to recognize where you end and the controller begins. Your brain adapts to this constant shaping, automating behaviors that align with their desires and penalizing deviation with subtle emotional consequences. This is why even moments of independence may be tinged with guilt, anxiety, or hesitation, because your internalized self-regulation has become a form of voluntary submission. Yet even in this seemingly inescapable psychological web, there exists the potential for awakening and reclamation, because awareness itself weakens control. The moment you can identify these patterns, name them, and recognize their influence, the internalized mechanisms begin to lose their automatic grip. You start to question why you feel anxious, guilty, or hypervigilant, and you separate your feelings from their influence. Your mind begins to learn that your thoughts, choices, and emotions can exist independently of the controlling person, and that self-trust can be rebuilt. Awareness does not immediately erase the years of subtle shaping, but it is the first act of liberation, the first step toward reconstructing autonomy and reclaiming your inner life. As you observe the interplay of manipulation, obedience, and internalized control, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Emotional control is not just about the other person's behavior, but about how your mind has been trained to respond. The real power lies not only in their actions, but in the invisible patterns that you have come to accept as normal, automatic, or unavoidable. Understanding this dynamic is essential because it allows you to stop collaborating unconsciously with manipulation, reclaim agency over your decisions, and begin the process of detachment, clarity, and emotional restoration. In the next section, you will discover practical strategies, insights, and approaches that will enable you to reclaim control of your mind, emotions, and life, breaking the cycle of influence once and for all. And now, as we arrive at the final section, it becomes clear that understanding emotional control is only the beginning, because awareness alone does not automatically undo years of subtle manipulation, internalized doubt, and conditioned compliance. But it does give you the critical power to reclaim your autonomy and rebuild a life rooted in your own choices, values, and emotional well-being. One of the first steps toward liberation is learning to distinguish between genuine care and disguised control, because the more clearly you can see the difference, the more effectively you can set boundaries that protect your energy, your voice, and your identity. A controlling individual often frames their behavior as love, concern, or loyalty. But the hallmark of authentic care is that it supports your freedom, encourages your growth, and respects your autonomy, rather than limiting, punishing, or reshaping you to meet another person's expectations. When you begin to recognize this distinction, your brain can start to rewire, learning that safety and connection do not require submission, silence, or self-erasure. Next, reclaiming your inner voice is essential, because for far too long, your thoughts, opinions, and feelings have been filtered, edited, or silenced to avoid conflict, guilt, or disapproval. Start by giving yourself permission to think independently. Journal your feelings, speak them aloud, or discuss them with someone you trust outside of the controlling dynamic. Each act of self-expression trains your brain to trust your instincts, recognize your worth, and honor your perspective, gradually weakening the automatic compliance that has been instilled. It may feel uncomfortable, frightening, or even wrong at first, because your mind has learned that asserting autonomy can lead to tension or loss. But this discomfort is the necessary signal that change is happening, and it is a sign that your internalized control is beginning to loosen. Setting and maintaining boundaries is another crucial strategy for dismantling emotional control, because boundaries communicate what is acceptable and what is not, even to people who have long relied on manipulation to maintain influence. Boundaries are not just about keeping someone out. They are about creating a safe internal space where your emotions, needs, and decisions are respected. Start with small, achievable limits, like refusing to tolerate guilt tripping, asserting your preferences in minor decisions, or taking time for yourself without needing permission. Over time, these small acts of resistance accumulate, retraining your nervous system to understand that you have the right to act independently and that your autonomy is not a threat. Every boundary you uphold strengthens your internal authority and teaches your mind that self-respect and personal integrity are non-negotiable. Rebuilding your support network is also critical because emotional control thrives on isolation and the narrowing of perspective. Reconnect with friends, family, mentors, or communities that affirm your value. Respect your boundaries and provide honest feedback. Exposure to diverse viewpoints and experiences helps recalibrate your perception of reality, reminding your brain that you are not solely dependent on the manipulator for validation, guidance, or emotional stability. Each healthy interaction reinforces your ability to trust yourself, recognize manipulation, and make choices that honor your well-being. Social reinforcement of autonomy counteracts years of conditioning, providing both emotional resilience and practical perspective for navigating challenging interactions. Another vital component of reclaiming yourself is addressing the internalized beliefs that have been implanted by the controlling person. Your mind may carry messages that you are not enough, that your needs are excessive, or that your independence is dangerous. These beliefs often persist long after the relationship dynamics have been identified, because they were reinforced repeatedly over time. Challenging these beliefs involves deliberate mental exercises, reminding yourself of your accomplishments, validating your feelings, and consciously affirming your worth and agency. Cognitive restructuring, mindfulness practices, and reflective journaling can be powerful tools because they allow your brain to form new associations and internalize a narrative of strength, autonomy, and self-trust. Every time you contradict an internalized lie with a truthful acknowledgement of your reality, the grip of manipulation weakens. Emotional regulation and self-care are equally essential because years of manipulation often leave the nervous system in a heightened state of vigilance, anxiety, or hyper-responsiveness. Activities that restore your body and mind, such as exercise, meditation, creative expression, or time in nature, send powerful signals to your brain that safety, relaxation, and self-prioritization are possible. By practicing consistent self-care, you retrain your body to tolerate independence, reaffirm your emotional needs, and strengthen resilience against future attempts at control. Self-care is not indulgence or weakness. It is the fundamental act of reclaiming your nervous system from patterns of anxiety and subordination, allowing your mind to operate freely and authentically once again. Finally, cultivating awareness of future relational patterns is a critical protective strategy because understanding emotional control allows you to recognize it before it takes hold again. Observe how people treat your opinions, respond to your boundaries, and influence your sense of self. Look for subtle cues, emotional inconsistencies, or attempts to isolate, guilt, or manipulate, and trust your internal signals when something feels off. Awareness is your most powerful tool because it allows you to intervene early, maintain autonomy, and prevent repetition of old patterns. By combining insight, boundary setting, self-care, and authentic connection, you begin to create a life in which your emotions, decisions, and identity belong to you and you alone. Ultimately, the journey through recognizing emotional control is not just about surviving a manipulative dynamic, but about reclaiming yourself. rebuilding your inner authority, and learning to live fully in alignment with your own values, desires, and truths. Awareness, action, and persistence allow you to dismantle invisible chains, cultivate healthy relationships, and step into a life where your mind, heart, and body operate in harmony rather than under another person's control. Emotional liberation is possible, but it begins with the simple, courageous act of seeing clearly, honoring yourself, and choosing autonomy every single day. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.